Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Joining us from all around the world, welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar discussion on outsource agri-food service, SMEs, support farms in Asia and Africa. This webinar is hosted by the Knowledge Platform for Inclusive and Sustainable Food Markets and Value Chains, that is also called KISM. KISM is part of the CGIAR initiative on rethinking food markets and implemented in partnership with ISEAL and Evidencia. I'm Swati Malhotra, Communications Officer with IFPRI and part of the Rethinking Food Markets Initiative and the KISM implementation team. A quick note that once all the panelists have shared their views, we will open for discussion with the audience. We invite you to engage actively throughout the webinar with your questions using the Q&A function and comments section using the chat function. Let us now talk about KISM and understand it. KISM is a research library and a knowledge platform for policy dialogue and exchange of ideas on rethinking food markets and value chains. In that, it is a space for engaging with others such as farmer organizations, food businesses, governments, and practitioners working in food value chains to collectively find ways to inform action through events and discussion. KISM's library hosts all the resources on the website. You can find a compilation of information and insights published by the Rethinking Food Markets Initiative and Evidencia, among other various credible databases. As for this webinar, you will also have access to the recording of the webinar and a blog summarizing the key insights on the KISM website. All you do is go to kismfoodmarkets.org. We invite you to explore our past webinars on the website as well. Let's move on to the agenda for today. After my welcome remarks, we move on to Rob. Rob Voss, who's the Director of Markets, Trade and Institutions Unit at IFPRI, and also the lead for Rethinking Food Markets initiative under CGIAR. We then move on to the main event, which is the presentation by Tom Reardon, a professor at Department of Agriculture, Food and Resource Economics at Michigan State University, as well as a non-resident fellow here at IFPRI, which takes us then into the discussion with Rob Bertram, Chief Scientist, Bureau for Resilience and Food Security at USAID. At about 9:40, we will open with our audience Q&A and then close the webinar. I give the floor to Rob Voss. Rob, over to you.
Thank you very much, Swati, and welcome to everybody for joining this seminar, which, as Swati mentioned, is part of the CGIAR research initiative on rethinking food markets. And the full name is Rethinking Food Markets for Inclusion and Sustainability. So the main objective of this research program is to find ways and understand market forces better to steer food systems towards greater inclusion, such that all food actors can derive sustainable livelihoods from, but also to make the food systems more sustainable. So in doing so, we are experimenting with a lot of research on new ways to organize supply chains, food supply chains, through innovations, through better market incentives to drive to those better outcomes. But none of this will help if we don't understand well the dynamics of the food system and the food supply chains itself. And this is a core part of the seminar today. We will look at new trends in how the food supply chains are being organized in developing countries, particularly the role of agricultural services that are called outsource agricultural services that farmers, including smallholders, use to improve their efficiency, but also overcome constraints to their production. That could be ranging from input provisioning through these outsourced services to harvesting, sorting, and packaging on the farm, to logistics and marketing. So it's a very dynamic new development, particularly in agri-food systems in developing countries, although it's not that new when we look at, for instance, manufacturing industries, which already for decades ago started outsourcing a lot of the activities and the tasks that previously they would all do within the same manufacturing firm, be it the molding, the design of products, or the marketing of products, all have become outsourced activities, and hence also one driver of the fact that most economies become service economies. So now a lot of this is also happening in different ways in developing countries in the food sector, and we're quite keen on hearing and understanding better what's happening, and particularly also how that is helping smallholder farmers and other food system actors in driving a better livelihood from the farm, and also what it means for the quality and the food standards that increasingly food actors have to comply with within the food system. So for this, we have no one better to talk about this than Tom Reardon, who's the professor of agriculture and resource economics at Michigan State University, and also a non-resident senior research fellow at IFPRI. And as a discussant, we'll have Rob Bertram, the chief scientist at the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security of USAID, who's kindly accepted to join us in this discussion. He'll be commenting on Tom Reardon's presentation. And after that, we'll go for Q&A from all of you. And so please send in your comments in the Q&A box or in the link provided to you. So with that, and without further ado, Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
yes.
We can. Tom.
Yes, I'm going to. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, Tom.
Thank you. I'll talk today about outsource agri-food service, micro, small, and medium enterprises supporting farmers in Africa and Asia. And this work has been done jointly with IFPRI colleagues, including Ben Belton, Bart Minton, Rob Vos, Xiaobo Zhang, and also other colleagues in other universities and institutes. I want to start with a historical view because really, when you think about a lot of these processes that occurred, they occurred in both currently developed countries, but also in developing countries and emerging markets. And if we look back at what happened in the 1890s in the US with the rise of reaper services, it's extremely interesting. Basically, the US government, USDA, the Department of Agriculture, was really worried about whether small farmers are going to be able to use the new technologies that were rising at that time. Machines that could thresh, that could reap, and then the emerging combines that both reaped and were able to thresh, and many other new developments in agricultural technologies. And the idea was that the worry was that these could only be adopted by the largest farmers. It couldn't be afforded by the smaller farmers because the investment necessary for them would just not pay off on use on a small farm. If you buy a big machine, you can use it just a little bit, and then you're done with your small plot, and you've wasted your money. So these machines, these new services, these new machines and equipment that were emerging were considered to be huge threshold investments that small farmers would not use. And here's the kind of investment we're talking about. A large reaping machine, this is 1890s, with 4 men sitting on the big machine and 3 tending the horses. So this is a massive investment and requires a lot of skill. But as the USDA started to do surveys of farmers, they found that the use of reaping and of these reaping machines was extremely widespread, including by small farmers, and it well exceeded the ownership of these machines. This led to the discovery that there had been a rapid rise in the 1890s of mobile reaper services, okay, where these are small and medium enterprises that have these sets of skilled labor attendants, the important investments in the machines, and these moved from state to state, basically following the seasons, harvesting early in the north, such as in Dakota, and then going south to make the the fixed costs of the machine pay and to meet demand. Now let's fast forward the film 100 years, and we find almost exactly the same phenomenon occurring in Asia. We'll look at the case of combine, which is the combination of the reaping or harvesting plus the threshing services for the case of rice in China and Myanmar. Here's a photo from IFPRI colleague Xiaobo Zhang, taken in Sichuan in 2009. And this work discovered the rapid rise of mobile outsource rice combine services starting in the late 1990s and then growing very rapidly in the 2000s. And these services were based in a province, Jiangsu, where there was a cluster of micro, small, and medium enterprises with these combines that then roved all over China. And in the cluster base, there were machine retailers, there were machine wholesalers, there were machine repair firms, all clustered together. And these outsourced services that you just saw roved from province to province, again following the harvest, exactly as we saw in the US case. And in this situation, very different from that US case 100 years before, these machines were mounted on trucks. And the government played a role, but not directly in terms of setting up the services. It just supported the formation of this cluster and helped it when it was on the road with security and with communication with villages. And then fast forward the film 10, 20 years and look at the case of Myanmar, where the same thing occurred with the rapid rise of mobile outsourced rice combines, such as the one you see based on the Kubota Japanese firm machine, maybe cost $40,000, quite a huge investment for a small farmer, okay? But these enterprises bought these machines, and then in a year and a half or 2 years, were able to pay off the machine because of the profitability of this enterprise. Here you see them moving the machine around on trucks, very similar to what we saw in China. And here's the KBZ bank that's providing loans to equipment purchasers that then became these mobile outsourced service providers. And again, similar to Jiangsu, you see that there was a cluster of these mobile services based in the dry zone. And with that cluster, there were machine retailers and wholesalers and repair firms, very similar to the China case. Very similar again to the China case and the US case. These firms, these outsourced services, move from county to county following the harvests mounted on trucks. And the role of support services to help those firms get going included the KBZ Bank, for example, that you saw, the government that was helping with loans, donors, USAID was involved in helping with credit, et cetera, for this, United Nations as well. And so that helped these machine services to get going, and then the demand pulled them forward and helped the development of it to be spontaneous after that. So if we think about the US case, and then we focus in on the Asia case, we can ask ourselves, what are the determinants of the rapid rise of these services? On the demand side, there was a booming urban market for grain and continues to be. But at the same time, perhaps surprisingly, in both places, there was a very rapid rise of rural wages. As Xiaobo Zhang has emphasized in the case of China, the turning point was occurring where rural wages were shooting up and farmers wanted to save labor. And yet small farmers couldn't afford to buy these large machines, or if they bought them, they wouldn't be economical because they wouldn't pay off for their small farms. And in many cases, small farmers could lack the needed skills to use the machines, to repair the machines, etc. On the supply side of these services, just as we've seen in wholesaling and processing and other aspects of the quiet revolution in micro and small and medium enterprises, there was a proliferation of these outsourced firms in the past several decades, started by traders or wholesalers that wanted to vertically integrate into agricultural services. They were started by medium farmers that had bought a machine adequate for their farm, but with excess capacity that they could supply to others. They were started by equipment retailers and others. And really the cost of these machines coming down over time and the accessibility of these machines due to the industrial revolutions in the US before, in Asia afterward, this has really brought down the cost of the farm machines and allowed these services to spread. And as I mentioned, in some cases, the credit, equipment credit was important, to, at least in the beginning, to help them buy the machines. But because it was so profitable, it was often self-supported then after that. Now, with Bennett's Law, there's been in the past couple decades in developing and emerging markets an extremely rapid increase in the demand for fruit and vegetables. And so farmers have very rapidly shifted into producing these products. And their needs have been similar to grain farmers, and the drivers of the rise of outsourced services to serve these farmers have been similar to those of grains that we just discussed. And yet there's a difference because the services for the fruit and vegetables, the horticultural farmers, have had to be more complex because the horticultural farming itself is more complex than the grain farming, with more stages and needs. And also the market has displayed more product differentiation into, for example, variations in quality and eventually into safety and eco-labeling, et cetera, as the markets develop. So there's two examples that I want to highlight here. One is based on Bart Minton's work with Ethiopian colleagues looking at outsourced services serving vegetable farmers. And again, the demand pull by urbanization and the rise of incomes driving the rapid increase in vegetable demands is an important pull factor driving the rise of both horticultural farming in Ethiopia and also the rise of these outsourced services. There was this supply response in the 2010s with a large increase in vegetable output. And part of that, and very important to that, was the emergence of a large cluster of vegetable farmers, especially a mix of medium land renting farmers as well as small farmers in the Rift Valley, several hours from Addis Ababa. And the rise of this cluster of farmers was driven by private investment in pump irrigation. These horticultural farms rapidly intensified and began using not only pump irrigation, but also purchasing seedlings, purchasing fertilizer, using pesticides, etc., to ramp up their vegetable production for the booming Addis Ababa market. And while they developed their horticulture farming, they were facing asset constraints for the intensification of this production. And this induced a demand for outsourcing, just very similar to what we saw in the grain case. And you saw that when we saw that the outsourcing services included equipment and labor teams managing migrant labor for digging wells and ponds, equipment services for mechanized plowing, equipment services and labor teams to plant seedlings, labor teams to apply chemicals, labor teams and equipment to harvest and market. So it's really A to Z services that were provided for this complex operation of horticulture, farming, and marketing. And a lot of the demand for these services that rose were by medium farmers. This was also the case, as we'll see in a second, with mango farmers in Indonesia, and a bit less for the very small horticulture farms, because the medium-sized farms were technifying their production more and intensifying, and had greater demand for use of these various equipment services and chemical application and marketing services. Although these services were also used by small farmers, but just proportionately less. And you saw a diversity of outsourced firms that rose from small firms doing very labor-intensive, simple tasks like the digging of the wells, to medium-sized outsourced firms that rose to do plowing, and larger firms that were doing seedling production and then planting the seedlings on the farm, and also trading, or let's say wholesaling, the output from the farms and delivering it to markets in Addis Ababa. A second example in horticulture that's very exciting is Indonesian mango. Again, you had this huge demand pull that was driving both the farming response and also the outsourced service response. With rapid urbanization and income increases, there was a rapid increase in the demand for mangoes, 75% of which went to cities. And this demand increase occurred in two waves. The first wave was essentially just planting a lot more mangoes and going from it being a niche crop to a commodity crop. And in the past decade, there was a further turn of the wheel, with it shifting from just commodity production of mangoes to product differentiation, where there was a need to source and use new varieties of mangoes, attain targets asked for by the wholesale markets and the rising supermarkets for mangoes of a certain size, in a certain cosmetic quality, a certain color. So there was both commoditization and product differentiation driving the market, and also driving what the outsourced services were required to do. So again, just as in the case of horticulture in Ethiopia, we see this rapid increase of mango farming in the 2000s, and the spontaneous rise of clusters of mango farmers in a few areas, for example, of Java, selling again to the urban market. And in this rise, there was medium farmers as well as small farmers, and an adoption of by these farmers of intensification technologies, such as the use of fertilizer, pesticides, herbicides, and hormones to increase seasonality, and also a differentiation of mango varieties. So there was a very deep and intense churning and change in the mango farming technology and choice of product and the size of the market, and all that was demanding services to be able to help with this pivot. So there was at the same time a rapid rise of medium farmers that had fairly large volumes and began to be able to purchase some equipment and use that as a base for some of the outsourced services. But in general, the small farms as well as the medium farms face severe asset constraints to do this pivot toward the increased production of mango, as well as the diversification and the intensification. They lack the equipment and the skills, for example, for pruning, for mechanized spraying, for harvesting and sorting, and for differentiated quality marketing. So there was a demand for services that embodied skills and equipment, but also were simply the provision of labor. And a lot of the farmers that were doing the mangoes had very diversified incomes and were working off farm, or even were absentee farmers. And we're looking again, just like the grain farmers in the US or in Asia, we're looking for ways to relieve the labor constraint. So the supply response to that was a very rapid rise in outsourced services that we called sprayer traders. And this had happened also in the Philippines, especially for the export sector, but then it occurred for the domestic mango sector. In Indonesia, it's almost only in a domestic mango sector with urban demand. And so these sprayer traders emerged, especially in the second half of the 2000s, and they included small and medium enterprises that were, for example, 10 clients on average for the smaller firms and 15 clients or more for the larger firms that had 1,500 trees or larger. And these firms supplied, just as in the case of horticulture done by individual firms in Ethiopia, but in this case, they were composite one-stop shop firms provided A to Z services from planting mangoes to preparing the soil, spraying the mango trees, which requires a lot of skill, bagging the fruit on the tree, harvesting, sorting, and marketing to wholesale markets mainly, but also to supermarkets. So this was driven by quality differentiation and increase of demand for mangoes, but mainly by the wholesale markets in Jakarta and to a certain extent, the emerging supermarket market. And the suppliers of these services were medium mango farmers, as I said, that had experience and skills and equipment, but they were also very much mango wholesalers that had a market network already and wanted to vertically integrate upstream to provide services to farmers. And they wanted to be able to increase the volume that they had as traders and differentiate their quality to compete as traders while earning money selling farm services. So the conclusions of this rapid tour in a few minutes of the rise of these outsourced services is that just as had occurred historically, more recently in Asia, and I could also tell the story of Latin America and in Africa, there was a rise of these micro, small, and medium enterprises providing outsourced services to farmers for grains, and then with more sophisticated and differentiated services to horticulture farmers and others. This demand by the farmers for these services was driven by the output market expansion and transformation. So farmers needed to pivot or adjust to the needs of these markets, first in terms of just reducing costs of labor, cost of the access to the machines, and then in terms of quality, first in quality, for example, in cosmetic and size of fruit, etc., and more in other examples in the paper that was accompanying this session, services, for example, needed to pivot toward eco-labeling and environmental and food safety attributes required by the market. And in all of this, you could say that just as in most of the proliferation of micro, small, and medium enterprises and supply chains in Asia and Africa and elsewhere, the government's role has mainly been one of support services rather than active direct engagement in these services. And we mentioned a few in this talk related to providing credit for the machine service providers and security for these services as they roved over long distances with expensive equipment. And of course, the services of the governments in wholesale markets on the demand side. So with that, I'll stop and shift to the discussion and the audience discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tom, for this really exciting talk about these new developments and its dynamics. I guess that's revolutionizing in some certain ways the organization of the food supply chains in this context and probably much broader. So there will be also many questions around this. So what are the outcomes of these processes? But let me give the floor for raising a number of those questions to Rob Bertram, as I mentioned, the Chief Scientist of the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security at USAID. Rob, over to you.
Thank you, Rob, and thanks also to Tom Reardon for a great presentation. I'm really delighted to be able to share a few thoughts here, reflecting on what Professor Reardon has said, but also to maybe challenge us to see where we can go further, because I think he's talking about something incredibly important in our quest for global food security, improved nutrition, and reductions in poverty. So the word transformation gets thrown around a lot these days, too often in my view, but I think what Professor Reardon has just talked about truly is an example, or truly are examples of transformation. And it's basically this idea of what can happen when producers are connected, especially smallholders, are connected to markets in ways that thrive, which is the whole, ethos of the program that's hosting us today, the KISM. I want to go, I was thinking one that you didn't talk about, Tom, that I think about a lot is Bangladesh, and what Bangladesh experienced when they brought in two-wheel tractors, when pumps came into areas that previously had had great, huge fallows. And we saw this incredible intensification of the markets. Now, in Asia, one of the advantages, you had densely populated areas, you had rural, you had urban centers, you had much more infrastructure by virtue of this much denser, and then generally speaking, you had more fertile soils and better rainfall conditions. So it had a lot going for it. But the great news now that Tom is also telling us about in the case of Ethiopia is that this kind of transformation is coming to Africa. So so this, I think the embedded goals here and what we see happening is right at the heart of what Feed the Future has been about, the U.S. Global Food Security Initiative since day one, which is now quite a few years ago. So I guess the fundamental opportunity here is to link smallholders with growing demand from cities and towns. Tom, you mentioned Bennett's Law, which is that when people have more money, they diversify their food sources. So we think about more nutritious foods like fruits and vegetables and animal source foods, but these are also more knowledge intensive. They're more food safety intensive. They often involve market risks that are more sophisticated than simple grain production, for example. And they're also, as Tom has told us, dependent upon a whole ecosystem of private sector actors. Now, the other thing I want to say here is what we're talking about here fundamentally, colleagues, is the capitalization of undercapitalized farming systems in smallholder-friendly ways. These are the ways that spread risk. They allow someone with some money earned in an urban environment to buy equipment and then provide services to a wide range of rural producers for whom that would never make sense as an investment, just as it didn't in the 1890s for many American farmers. The good news here is we've got more and more tools that are making these systems more efficient. Just think of the importance of digital tools, weather, markets, cultural guidance, a whole range of things that support better decision-making by farmers, but also by the businesses that are trying to make money by serving those farmers and then connecting them to those lucrative urban markets. So there's this small and medium enterprise ecosystem. Tom, you'd call it sometimes the hidden middle because we don't always see it, but a lot of your work, some of which you didn't talk about today, has shown how enormous that middle and vibrant that hidden middle is in places like Nigeria and Zambia. The other thing I want to call out here, colleagues, is we talk a lot about youth. Just imagine the attractiveness of these kinds of jobs that are cell phone mediated, knowledge intensive. They're absolutely made for young people who have greater literacy and numeracy skills and who are perhaps less tied to being on the farm or looking for alternatives off the farm. So it's also very attractive from this standpoint. So the private sector is delivering services, information, inputs, credit, and market access. Although we know a lot of the credit is actually coming from families themselves. Tom also does some work on this. I guess one thing that I think is also embedded here is the idea that just as farmers cannot be, the businesses cannot be technology agnostic. And I think this is where the private sector and the public sector, we need communication there around new varieties that are more climate resilient, around other opportunities. Often I know, Tom, you tell us that what these small and medium enterprises really need are roads, grid, and freedom from bribes. And I think that those are key factors from the public sector side that can really foster this. The other is some of the policy specifics in terms of taking tariffs off pumps or agricultural equipment to bring down the price, to make the entry threshold for investors more attractive in ways that generate private goods, but also generate a lot of public goods and a more affordable and nutritious and safer food system. So I want to say a little bit in closing about how do we go beyond markets-driven service provision. We know that the private sector is well positioned in areas that are connected to road and grid, and where these are thriving enterprises that can be developed, where there's small-scale irrigation. Zambia, Tom, you tell us that 200,000 Zambian smallholders moved into vegetable production in the last decade. That's fantastic. But what about the places in the hinterlands where we're basically dealing with rain-fed agriculture? And I want to just call out some thinking there from the Stockholm International Water Institute that's looking at the opportunities there for private and possibly public investment in ways that would help offset the costs associated with better water management in rain-fed systems, ultimate diversification, maybe into perennials or trees or other things. So I would love to see more work from the economists, Rob, at IFPRI, at MSU, and elsewhere, about how we could try to justify more public investment into these areas where it's not occurring organically as fast as it needs to, the way we are seeing it where there's in the peri-urban or the areas where you have rapid few hours away from an urban market in terms of moving product. So and I do think also that this whole issue of water in farming systems, we've heard a lot about the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils, which emphasizes soil health from Carrie Fowler and from many others, a lot of interest around the world. But the water piece of that, whether we're talking rain-fed or irrigated, is significant. So finally, just closing by saying that food systems gets talked about a lot. It's hard for me. I see it compelling for climate change. I see it compelling for negative dietary transitions, although the solutions there remain challenging. But it's not always so compelling for reducing poverty and malnutrition in rural areas where those challenges are greatest. And I think what Tom and Rob are talking about here today is an example of where it is compelling in driving those human benefits and advancements through a really targeted food systems approach rooted in production systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob, for these, well, I would say encouraging comments, but also intriguing comments. So we're now moving to the Q&A part of the discussion, and please put your questions into the Q&A box. We have a couple of questions already coming in. So I'm going to give it back to Tom for maybe first to address some of the points raised by Rob Bertram, and then I'll go to at least I'll introduce one of the questions that are in the chat box. But maybe to start, I think what one point that Rob was making, Rob Bertram, is okay. Now, can this dynamics also be steered in directions for water management and overcome the hurdles there, and what would be needed there? If I understood his comment well, there likely also what would be the incentives needed for these kind of services to also promote the implementation of better climate resilient technologies and practices in the field. And then related to that also sort of something that's sort of hidden in your talk is in the end, now who's most using these services? So it makes certain things more accessible also to smallholder farmers, but it seemed from the mango case in Indonesia that's it's also more the medium-sized farms that are able to tap into these services. So then the question is that if there's a cost implication also for the smallholders that's too big, to what extent a credit supply would be sufficient also for them to be able to tap into these services. And the last question also ties in, I'll stop there and give it to you, Tom, is the question by Gurmakasi of Icarda, who asked, well, what would be the role of private financial sector in this, or should it be the government that has to play a leading role in providing this access to credit and finance to the small medium enterprises, but I guess also to smallholder farmers to be able to make use of these services. All right, a whole bunch of questions at one go. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you. These are great comments. Thank you, Rob, for your great comments and great questions and comments from the participants. I think that taking it, let me start with the scale issue. Most of these, or all of these, outsourced service firms are micro, small, and maybe medium firms. As I mentioned in the case of Ethiopia, there's, and it's the same thing in Indonesia, you have different size outsourced firms that are providing different kinds of services and ranges of services, sometimes with interface with different sizes of clients. So you might have smaller firms that are providing simpler services to smaller farmers in each of those two countries. And then small firms or medium firms that are providing a larger suite of services to more technified or intensified medium farmers. And so in a sense, it's there's a differentiated service for differentiated clients. But Rob's point is correct that a lot of the, let's say 2/3 of the demand for the services has tended to be the medium farmers or small farmers, depending on the area, because a lot of micro farmers are involved in these, in the production of fruit and vegetables, for example. And they tend to be also diversified in their income streams so that they're working off farm. They have, for example, their mango or their vegetables on farm, and they're looking to save labor, but they also need skilled service teams for the production, and they don't have those skills, or they would just have to hire and use the transaction costs and time to search for and hire skilled actors for each of the different tasks. So this is like a one-stop shop that's very useful for the medium farms and perhaps less wide sequence of services for the smaller farms. And I think that that goes to Ricardo's question, which is about whether these firms can service very small farms. And certainly the perfect case is what I showed in Shaobozhang, and I worked on this outsource services for rice farmers in China that are approximately the size of, or even smaller than, the Bangladesh farms. So there's definitely a flexibility and differentiation that's possible in these services for the scale and needs of different kinds of farmers, which is valuable. Second general point is about finance and the role of the government versus the private sector that Girma brought up, and also Mehrab brought up. I think that very often in the case of the quiet revolution and the hidden middle and the proliferation of services, whether the hidden middle is in the output supply chain or it's in this case in the agricultural services supply chain, the great majority of finance, both to start up and to working capital of these firms, we found has been own capital. In other words, retained earnings from profits from the activity, or subsidization, for example, from funds of rural non-farm employment into these outsourced activities. But there has been a role in several countries of seed capital, especially for buying equipment by these small and medium enterprises, as I mentioned in the case of Myanmar. What is the justification for that in terms of a pro-poor agenda? You could say that it's not so much direct as indirect, because the loans are going to small and medium enterprises that require perhaps an initial loan to get this business going, but then the services are provided to medium and small farmers. So it's essentially an indirect flow of finance that's available for that. But as I said, very often the private sector lenders, informal sector, or own retained earnings play a major part in the continuation and evolution of the sector. Third, and I want to do a shout out for work of Sawida Liverpool Tassier in Nigeria, and I've been involved in this in terms of analyzing maize wholesaler needs, but really this extends directly to the needs of these small and medium enterprises in outsourcing services, is a combination of soft infrastructure, which includes, as I mentioned a moment ago, to some seed capital. And when in our surveys, we often find that just 5% of the total funding of these sectors is from outside loans. Okay, so this is seed capital, but very important and often missing in discussions, but rising in importance in discussions, is the need for security services. Rob mentioned reduction of, let's say, bad side of security services, which is demanding bribes. But the good side of security services is that in Nigeria, we found the greatest plague of traders is banditry, okay, and as well as conflict like Boko Haram. So you have the case of Xiaobo Zhang's work in China showing that the police services accompanying the outsourced services roving across vast space with very expensive machinery was central to the development of those services. So really security services, and governments have played the role of information, both coordinating with villages to aggregate demand for these services, etc. But very basic to all this is you saw those trucks and you saw those firms, is they demand hard infrastructure. So there's soft infrastructure, and this is the other side of the demand, let's say by maize traders in Nigeria and Sawida's work, but also what we found in the outsourced services in these other cases is the demand for good road quality and electricity, et cetera, that's necessary for the clusters. So there's hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure as roles for the government. And third, I would say that a little bit related to the scale question is the spatial question, which is, do these services avoid or serve hinterlands? I think one lens on that question that should be put is the fact that 90% of farmers in rural areas of the regions that we're studying are in peri-urban areas that are rural areas near cities, or intermediate areas that are pretty close to cities. Only 10%, in the case of Tanzania, for example, only 10% of the farmers are far from cities. So we're talking in almost all the countries, 90% of the farmers are really have accessible both the output market, which is in towns and cities, and also services, as Rob was saying, that could be based in secondary cities or tertiary cities, and then fan out and serve the farmers, or be based in large villages. So I think that as infrastructure improves, of course, the reach of those services becomes more and more profitable. These are private enterprises, becomes profitable. I mean, to go behind a mountain and up into a rocky area to be able to serve the farmers is difficult. Improving the infrastructure for the reach is what could make these services more accessible. So I wanted to end with those three general responses on roles of government and finance, spatiality and hinterland, and scale of both suppliers and demanders.
Thanks, Tom. And also thanks for helping me as a moderator, because in passing you've answered most of the questions that were in the chat box. I think it's to give maybe 1 more minute to address a final question from Anne de Brouw, who raises the question also in relation to Rob Bertram's point, is that some of these technologies would translate too much of rain-fed sub-Saharan Africa. In the US, China, Indonesia, one can argue that the development of these MSMEs occurs when the relative price becomes attractive and the institutional environment makes those investments feasible. So in other words, is it the rising wages that's important, plus the institutional environment at the same time? You already said a few things about it, but maybe in closing, your final question.
Yeah, this is a fantastic point. Xiaobo Zhang has done such important work in identifying where country after country enters what is called the Lewis turning point, where rural wages start to rise very quickly and opportunity costs of farmers go up. And I think you could argue that our work on rural non-farm employment has been relevant in this case, because farmers, let's say in the case of Africa, let's say 60% of full-time equivalent activity of farmers in Africa is done off farm, and in the case of Asia, that's 75%. Okay, and so these are really diversified farmers facing rising rural wages, and they have reasons. In recent work that we've done, Ben Belton and I and others have done on combine services in Myanmar, it turned out that the demanders of these services were especially farmers that had their own non-farm enterprises, okay, and they wanted to save time because it was quite a high payoff to their time to work on their SMEs, for example, in cottage services or some other rural non-farm employment. And so they basically hired the combine services to save them time to be able to work on their farm. So I think that there are all these forces in country after country. In the Xiaobo Zhang's work, he's showing Bangladesh entered the queue and had the Lewis turning point. China had the Lewis turning point. In many areas of Africa, Myanmar, for example, also you see very rapid rise of rural wages. So in parts of Africa also, you see the rise of rural wages. So the demand side for labor saving is much more than one thing. And the other point that Alan's making, that's excellent, is the institutional environment and really the payoff to the products that are being produced. And that's a function, as I obsessively want to underscore, of the bones and blood. I said it in another seminar of webinar of IPRI, but the bones and blood of the food system, of the wholesale markets, the logistics, the roads, all of this makes profitable any investment, either by service firms or by farms, in grains or in horticulture, and allows this to be profitable and to reduce over time the risk of these investments, as Rob was talking about, and to deepen and thicken the markets instead of having thin, volatile markets. So that market base, which is an investment, which is also laced with various kinds of institutional supports, the ability, for example, market regulations related to vehicles and transport, liberalization of imports of machines, and of course, looping back to Rob's point, the institutional setting of bribes and governance that in the end really is fundamental in setting the profitability both of moving inputs to rural areas, moving outputs out of rural areas, and justifying and supporting profitable investments by small private entrepreneurs that are providing these marvelous services to small and medium farmers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. Okay, we've gone over time, but this is a great way of closing this seminar and this discussion. More questions have come in, but I suggest that we try and take those forward. We have a discussion forum on the KISM, the knowledge platform for this initiative. And also the paper will come out soon and be made available to you. So with that, let me thank Tom Reardon for another great talk as part of this seminar series, to Rob Bertram for his insightful comments, and to all of you for the comments and questions that you've raised during this seminar. So as I said, we'll try and continue this conversation in the next seminars, as well as allow you to access the paper that's related to this research. With that, over to you, Swati, to close out this seminar.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you to everybody for being a splendid audience today. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Please watch out the KISM space on kismfoodmarkets.org for a summary blog and webinar recording that is to follow. And to be in the loop of all upcoming KISM activities, events, and new resources, please join our mailing list here with the QR code you see on the screen. Alternatively, you could also join our mailing list by going to the KISM website and clicking subscribe on the top menu bar. Once again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists, our moderator, and the entire team. I wish all of you a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.